Hi, I'm Rhonda Pick, Managing Editor with Pig Health Today, and with me is Dr. Daniel Hendrickson. He's a veterinarian at Star Veterinary Service in Farmland, Indiana. Daniel, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Managing the reproductive health of sows and gilts in the breeding herd is an ongoing challenge. When working with clients, what are some of the most common reproductive challenges you help them address?
I would say one of the most common things is just managing gilts and getting gilts to cycle and getting them to come in heat on time, and then not only getting them to cycle, but also just make sure that we get an ideal conception rate that makes them perform and makes them gilts viable later on. I mean, it's very, very important that we get these gilts off to a good start because we see long term on how successful we are getting these gilts bred, and the numbers of pigs they have set them up for being successful in later parities throughout their life in the sow herd. So that's probably one of the biggest questions that we battle with, is just making sure we get these gilts cycling and breeding appropriately.
And how would you compare common reproductive challenges you see with gilts, which you've already touched on, versus sows in the herd?
Typically sows, throughout normally do pretty well. We'll get into blips through the fall, through August, September, late July when it's really, really hot out. We'll see a little decrease in sows coming out of the crates that want to cycle within that under 5-day window. We get a few more sows that want to straggle out to that 6, 7, 8-day mark post weaning to come into heat. But that's typically throughout just in that couple months during December and January. Sometimes we got to use other techniques to help manipulate these sows and gilts to help them to come in during that time of year and have a higher success rate.
What would you say are some of the root causes or underlying factors leading to problems getting gilts and sows rebred?
Yeah, so more on the gilt side, I think definitely gilts is boar exposure. So making sure that we're getting these gilts exposed to boars starting a certain time period as they come through the GTU and into the sow herd, making sure not only they get a boar exposure, but multiple boar exposure. So they'll react differently to different boars put off different amounts of pheromone, and just making sure that they get exposed so then they want to come and heat. Also, gilts is adequate size, adequate age, adequate body condition. All those things can affect that. For sows, I believe the main one that would affect sows coming out of farrowing is body condition. If we go into the farrowing house too skinny, then we're going to come out of the farrowing house too thin. And then the sow's body goes into a protective mechanism where they know that they're not in good enough condition to cycle like they need to. And so we'll see some delays in estrus due to that.
And back to your comments about proper age and weight for gilts, what are your recommendations there as far as target age and weight for breeding?
Yeah, so age, typically I like the gilts to farrow around a year age. So if you back that up 16 weeks, then we're at that 36, 38 weeks right in there is where we're at, and then 300-pound plus. So one, we want them old enough, but we also want them big enough so when they do farrow later on, they're big enough as they go into the farrowing crate to decrease dystocia problems and make sure that they farrow adequately.
What are some of the common tools in your toolbox that you're using with clients to manage reproductive health?
Yeah, and so, the biggest thing is our ideal situation is to stay away and try to use that some of our hormones, our injectables, our PG600, our matrix, those type of things at a bare minimum. We want to try to get to the root cause on why. Maybe is it a genetic issue? Is it a management issue? Is it a poor exposure issue? At all possible, we want to try to get down to the root cause instead of just using some of those products as a crutch. But then if we can't, and that's the time that we'll use some PG600 to stimulate those gilts along with the boar exposure to try to get them to cycle that first time. And then once we get that, then we've got them set up to be successful.
What would be some best management practices when you are using PG600?
So one of the things I run to make sure that people understand on PG600 is if gilts are already cycling or they're already in the middle of cycle and we just happen to miss those gilts or we're not doing a very good job of heat detection, PG600 isn't going to change a cycle. So if a gilt cycled 7 days ago and we just happen to miss it, or the breeding crew happened to miss it, or she didn't do a very strong heat, then that PG600 is not going to do anything. It's not going to change her cycle. She's not going to come in heat. She'll continue to go through her normal cycle and cycle at that 21-day mark like we had. The only time PG600 is successful is when a gilt's either been cycling and quit cycling through her estrus, or she's never cycled before. And then that's when we can use PG600 to stimulate that gilt to cycle that first time and then go from there.
What about using the matrix? What are some best practices related to that?
Yeah, so on Matrix is a great tool to help to organize a group of sows, to organize a group of females or gilts, to help them put them into groups. And there's numerous reasons why we'd want to do that. Are we going to batch farrowing? Are we doing a breeding project? Are we trying to get some gilts moved into a different group because we've got a lot of gilts a certain age and we're trying to delay that estrus or move them into a different group? Matrix just delays estrus, and so it works on females that are already been cycling. And so what we'll do to help make sure we get all gilts. So if we get them ones that haven't been cycling or ones that have been cycling, we want to get them in a group. We'll do the Matrix or one of the progesterone products for 14 days. And then the last day or the day after the last dose of Matrix, we'll go ahead and give them a dose of PG600. And then we make sure that we catch both groups of females and get a highest percentage of gilts to cycle coming off of that program.
Do you have any final advice related to either boar exposure or some of these other reproductive tools in the toolbox that you'd like to share with producers?
Yeah, so I guess, a couple of the main things is boar exposure, use multiple boars. And sometimes it takes on these gilts, especially these gilts that are in pins, is getting those boars in with the gilts. So maybe use a boar and go in that pin with the gilts. A lot of these gilts, some of these genetics are pretty low stress and more reserved and calmer females, so they necessarily won't come up to the gate. Well, you're not going to get very good exposure if you don't actually get that boar into that pin and get that boar, let him root on them, let him actually get in contact with that female. And then the other ones that we actually, that we kind of hit on before is just understanding how the different products work when we have to do estrus manipulation. So PG600, if they're already cycling, not going to do us much good. And Matrix, if they haven't cycled before, necessarily will make sure that those gilts cycle as they come out.
What about producers who may be considering using PG600? What are some considerations of how you'd know you'd be a good candidate to successfully use that?
Yeah, so I think it's one that maybe, there are different genetics out here that some females are just higher stress. So we see those type of females cycle more naturally. They're easier to catch in heat just because they're a little higher stress females. And so, but there's some genetics that do an absolute fantastic job once we get them bred, but at gilts, they are a little tougher to get bred. So that might be a great opportunity to help get those gilts cycling and get them going a little faster. Maybe we can get them bred a little earlier than what that genetics might typically want to naturally come into heat. But a good example of how I suggest some of my clients use PG600 is once we definitely know those gilts are of age and we know they're the right size, we'll really stimulate those gilts hard with multiple boars to try to get them to cycle. And we'll do that for a 4 or 5, even 6 week period there, really, really intensely. And then that's the time that we'll go in and use the PG600 to help stimulate those gilts that haven't cycled within that first window to try to get those to come in. I never recommend us wait much longer than that because we don't want these females to get out closer to 10, 11 months old before we start trying to get them bred. By then, man, we've really burned up some of the time that we need to get those gilts bred and get them into the system and make those females profitable into the herd.